Janome.
Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to finally wrap up on the 18th century pumpkin dress that I have been making. If you have not seen parts 1 and 2, I will link them in the description below. Otherwise, let's make a robe à la Française. So I started by just cutting out all of my fabric. I was using an orange taffeta that I purchased for about $1 at a local fabric warehouse. So this is actually a polyester taffeta, not a silk taffeta, and I'm totally okay with this because, you know, it's a good color. I used pattern 8578, which is the Simplicity pattern by American Duchess, but I also used the pattern book to go with it. And after cutting all my fabric and my pattern pieces out, I just went straight to town to marking everything on the wrong side of the fabric. This was a solid hour of work, which is fine because it really helped in the long run. One thing I will note, I do French seams throughout this entire process, and I did not account for the fact that I was doing French seams, so some of my pleat placement is going to be a little bit off, and I'm just going to say that now, and then we'll just get right into it. So I start by pinning the side front to the side back panel at the notch all the way down, and I am going to be doing French seams on this. So if you don't know how to do a French seam, I'm not really going to explain it too much because I do it all the time, but I will show you kind of what I do to tackle the narrow hem part of it at the top. After pressing my seam, I do clip that top bit right there. That's where our notch is, or where our marking was. And then once I've finished my French hem, I will press this out, and then we'll start on the narrow hem up at the top. For the top narrow rolled hem, I am going to press and fold this edge open, and then I stitch it down. This part is actually where the pocket will go, or where the slits to be able to get to my pockets are. So it's really important that this part is here. I don't recommend skipping it at all. So now that it's time to pleat this section of my fabric, I actually pull the instructions or the pattern piece back out because I want to see which direction the pleats are supposed to go. I didn't mark arrows on my fabric because I didn't want to be overly excessive in marking, and so I kind of had to use both the picture and the pleats to kind of figure it out. It was a little difficult at first because I didn't take into consideration my French seam, but I also didn't I don't know. It was a little difficult at first because the pleat marking is on the wrong side of the fabric, but the way they want you to pleat is so that they fold up on the right side, and so I had to keep switching from each side of the fabric, but I did eventually get there and get my pleats pinned and the top of them sewn down. So I now had to attach the bodice piece following the markings, and I did notice at this point that my pleat placement was slightly off to line up with this bodice piece, and so I ended up having to go back and move my pleats around and basically redo that section so that this bodice piece would line up properly. You'll see here how it doesn't line up. Once I did that though, it ended up working out fine, and I was able to clip this edge and move on to the next step. So I clipped along the curve there, and then I started pressing this seam up to kind of help with the ease, and then also to kind of help with this next step. So I cut my armhole at a space in between size 8 and 10 because of my mock-up, and then I kind of realized that I was totally a size 10 and not even near a size 8. So if you see that little extra bit right there, that's totally because I wasn't sure what size to make, and it's easier to take away than it is to add. So I do end up clipping that later on. I don't know if I took video of it or anything, but I will end up clipping that little segment there to make it line up better. But I will just pin this down, and then I'm gonna top stitch it down. All right, I have moved on to the Sackback Pleats now, and I'm just kind of like matching up my markings, and then I will pin this all the way down. This will also be a French seam. Again, I'm not going to go over this. There's lots of tutorials on how to do this, but I will do this in a French seam, and this also places my pleats just a little off. So when we get to that part, I'll kind of talk about it for a hot second. So when I was pleating this sackback, I don't know if I'll show you the actual markings on the underside, but I had to sew through the marking that was on the back. So basically I just, on the back like center seam. So basically I just tried to bring this pleat piece as close to the seam as I possibly can. I should have brought it a little bit closer as well, which you'll see later on the difficulty that I had doing with this, and it ended up being a little bit too wide. But I follow the pleat instructions, and I do the best that I can to get this pleated down with like the knowledge that I have like an extra 1/2 inch taken off of my fabric from my French seam. I also pressed these down. I don't know, I can't remember if it says to do that in the instructions, but I just pressed like the top bit down because it was actually easier to manage than not pressing it down. Once that top was sewn, it was time to hand baste 4 inches from the top, and that posed some issues. It was just a little difficult to do because you're sewing through a lot of layers of polyester, but I was able to do it. It is probably some of the worst hand basting I've ever done, but we take it out later anyway, so it's not a huge deal. And now I get to do my next French seam, where I add the side back panel, these back pieces to the side back panel, and we will then again pleat those down some more. After following the pleating on the top and then once again doing some more hand basting 4 inches from the top, I can sew my shoulder pieces together, and then I kind of just let this whole thing sit on my mannequin because we're gonna move on to some sleeves next. I will say at this point it was way too wide, and you'll see me adjust it I think once I add the lining bits. So now we're going to sew up the sleeve seams, and I do this in a batch with the lining. It doesn't tell you to do it on the lining yet, but I'm going to do it right now because I think that these things just go a little bit faster when you do them as a batch. So we are going to sew this up, and then I will also sew in the gather stitches that they have you sew in on the top, and yeah, that's what we're going to do right now. To fit the sleeve into the dress portion of this, I start by lining up the 2 dots that are near the bottom of the sleeve. I accidentally didn't mark both notches, but I kind of just like found out where they were and started sewing there, so I know that my gather line starts and ends at the notches. So I started these 2 dots in the center, and then I also go up all the way to the top, and I line up the top marking with the marking on the shoulder. And this is when I actually decide to start my gathering. The first sleeve I did, this is actually the second sleeve. The first sleeve I kind of did trial and error to figure out how I wanted to do this to show you guys. But basically I pull the string, or pull my gathers until the top 3 dots all line up, or circles. They're small circles, I don't know why I call them dots, and then I'll pull it again until the notch lines up with the gather stitch. I will repeat this on the other side, so like if you can see how I kind of divide the sleeve into 2 portions. So now I'm gonna pull my gathers so that the second the dot on the left, I guess, or this small circle on the left lines up. And then I will also line up the notches with the end of the gather stitch. And this is how I found like the fastest and best, most like easily distributed way. On the other sleeve, I did pin all of the markings, and then I ran myself into a corner of not being able to gather because I had pinned through the gather pieces. So this is just how I found doing it, and I will repeat this for the lining lining of the sleeves as well. So when I get to the lining, I'm not gonna show you that part. I'm just gonna like do this exact same thing. So yeah, and I also trimmed this down at this point as well. So let's work on the lining. This was a little bit different from what I'm used to, so I will try to explain it the best I can. I did stitch on this line all the way around, and then I also trimmed those little edges like they said, and I marked where the ribbons are gonna go. I've never done lining like this before, so it was rocky for me, but basically now at this point, now that I've stitched this all down, and now this is like the right side of the fabric that we're looking at, I'm going to be pinning my 12-inch strips of ribbon. I luckily had just enough left. I didn't even think about buying this item when I was going into this, so the fact that I had this much left was miraculous. All right, after sewing those down, I'm gonna roll this inside and get this stitched down as well. This lines up pretty well, in my opinion, like the clipping with the stitching, and it actually works out pretty well. It just, again, like it was a bit confusing for me because I've never done lining of a sackback gown like this before. So I will like roll this in, pin it, and then I'll go sew it. And now we're gonna assemble the rest of this lining. Now I'm just going to pin the front lining pieces to this back piece at the shoulder and side, again lining up the notches and everything and the dots, and I'll sew this down as well. And now I can add the sleeves, the lining, the sleeve lining exactly how I did before. I'm not gonna go over this again. You can just go back to that part of the video, but I'm gonna do it the exact same way, no changes. Then I'm going to turn up the bottom edge of the lining and pin it and get it ready to sew before sewing this into the actual pieces. So now it's time to pin the lining into onto the actual outer garment, and this is when I realized that my pleats were not lining up properly at all with the lining. You can see that huge gap there. That is pretty massive. So I did something that's probably like not great, but I just kind of folded that whole section in half and pinned it and called it a day. I just was like pretty over the whole pleat situation to begin with, and I don't think it looks bad, and that's just me. So then I just kind of moved on from that section and continued to pin my lining because every other notch and marking lined up perfectly. It was pretty strange to me. So I just kind of took it as a whatever and moved on. I did make sure that the pleat was in the right direction, obviously, and I did try really hard to make sure the pleats didn't look absolutely horrendous. But at that point I was just like, I don't really know like what I could do or adjust, so I just kind of moved along. So now that they were sewn together, I did do the understitch like it says in the instructions, and I was able to like manage to get it to go all the way around the curve. So I just understitched all of it. I think in the end, oh, never mind. We'll talk about the back once we go to do the last step on the pleats. But anyway, now I'm pressing this all down, getting a nice clean crisp edge because I did not want to top stitch this, and top stitching is kind of my clutch, and I was like, no way, Jose, I'm not going to top stitch today. So I didn't end up top stitching it, I just pressed it, and we'll talk about the pleats a little bit later. So now it's time to narrow rolled hem the side and the bottom. If you remember from my last video or 2 videos ago on the underskirt, I actually did this baste stitch on machine because I didn't read the instructions and I didn't do it right. So now I'm doing the basting stitch by hand, like the instructions say, and then I will go in and do the actual like stitch of it right after this. I will say this took me a really long time. I don't remember how many hours, but I will say that I was practicing with my thimble. You can kind of see it off screen, right to the left. I was practicing on and off with my thimble. I did finally invest in a thimble. I think it's a size too big. When I got it, I thought it was great. Every time I work with it, it feels like it's gonna fall off, and it does fall off sometimes. So I don't know. I might try to find one that's one size smaller, but either way, I definitely did do the basting stitch, and then I'll show you here in a second the next stitch. All right, here we go. I am doing this little stitch here. I can't remember what it's called. You can see me struggle busting with this thimble. I have to basically retrain how I hold my thread or how I hold my needle, but either way, it's gonna take practice. I'm very aware of that. It's gonna take getting some used to, but I'm here to try it, and if it takes a little bit longer to do some of these hems, it does. But yeah, so this stitch and the basting stitch are explained in the 18th century book, that dressmaking book that American Duchess wrote, and so they're kind of in the instructions, but like that's how I used it, and that's how I figured it all out, was the 18th century dressmaking book. But yeah, I do this all the way up each side and down the hem, around the hem. All right, and now I'm gonna sew the lining into the skirt area. That narrow rolled hem really made a difference. It just made it so easy to line all of this up and get it right. You can see I've given up on the thimble at this point. I promise you, I do practice with it. It's just depending on like my mood and filming and how much time I have to finish things, I won't always have my thimble. I won't always use it because it's hard. It's not easy. Learning new things is not very easy. Alright, so now we're going to start decorating the dress. I guess that's what we can call it, embellishing the dress. Basically, we are going to be adding these pretty flounces to the sleeves. I'm also adding a little bit of lace on the bottom. At this point, I think I stopped using the instructions. I'm so sorry, guys. So bear with me on this. So basically, I am just going to cut these out. This is my piece. You're supposed to cut out a template, I think, and I didn't do that, and I also didn't do that for the trim this time either. So we're going to cut this out with our pinking shears. These are our scalloped pinking shears. We're going to cut the other one out as well. So for this lace under part, I'm literally going to be doing a running stitch, probably about 1/2 inch to 1 inch long, just throughout the top portion of this lace. I'm going to do this all the way around without gathering it until I get it into the bottom of the sleeve. So I just kind of go all the way through this top part, running stitch, and then we'll work on sewing it down in a second. Oh, and I should mention that the length of this lace piece is the same length as, it's double the length of the flounce. So I just laid this over the flounce pattern piece and doubled that. Using the same thread that I had used to gather, I am tacking this down into the inside of this. The yellow part is my lining. I didn't have enough orange left over to make lining out of it, so I don't know why I used yellow, but I did. I should have used whatever scrap I had in my stash next time. But yeah, and then I'm just gonna kind of hand sew this down. Alright, for the actual flounce piece, I am basically going to do 2 gather stitches, one closer to the top and one closer to this about 1.5 inches away from that. And I try really hard to make these 2 gather stitches or these running stitches the same so that when I gather them down, they will create a pleat looking effect. So yeah, I will just kind of start at the top and do about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch, and then go down and under and down and under until I get to the finish line, to the end. And then I will leave the tails long to gather in the next step. To gather all of this down, I pull both of the strings at the same time, and then to actually tack it down or stitch it down, I'm basically, because I've created these pleat looking things, I kind of try to just tack each piece down from the top, and I go around both pieces, both times. So I'll go at the top of the gather, and then I'll go back down at the bottom of the gather, and I'll just tack these little pleats down, and I think it looks really good. At first I was going to add beads to it, and I'm so glad I didn't. I'm so glad I skipped that. So that's how I sew this down, and then the sleeve is done. Let's move on to the stomacher. So I did do an entire video on just the stomacher embroidery, and I will link that in the description below, but I still needed a way in which to get that stomacher onto the dress, and I still had like these literal scraps of this yellow taffeta left over, so I decided to make a base stomacher out of them using the pattern, and these will get sewn in and will actually have hooks at the front. So I did like create them and line them, and then same with the actual green one. There's green taffeta is lining it as well. Flip them inside out, and I will press them. And then I do sew on the hooks by hand. And what I actually ended up doing, and I'm pretty sure I didn't get footage of this, is I hand stitched snaps onto this so that my green stomacher would go on top. This means that in the future, if I bought more of this fabric, I could make bows and kind of switch out the stomacher. I know this is not historically accurate, and I know all of this, like somebody's probably gonna be reading me to filth at some point about this, but you know what? I really like it, and it looks really good to me, and I think that having the multi-purpose is just gonna be a little bit more fun for me, and yeah, ultimately it just made it easier, and I'm really glad I went that way. And I will try to get some video of the snaps at some point and post on Instagram or something so you kind of get an idea, but I totally just skipped out on filming any of that because time. So we're getting close to the finish line on this. All that's left is making and adding this trim. I followed the instructions and cut out the amount I needed, the length of the strips and stuff. The only thing I didn't do is make the like scalloped edges, if that makes any sense. I skipped the actual scalloping, like the creating of the scallops, and I'm just making these strips. I know that this is not historically accurate, I don't care. So I am making right here, I'm basically pressing in the wider sections of this, and I will also press the smaller sections in half, and then I will mark them with a pin every 12 inches. And this is how I know when I need to stop and gather. I do have an entire video on how to actually make this gathered trim, so I'm kind of gonna skip that part, and we're gonna go straight from pressing this and prepping it to the next step, which is going to be pressing it open and getting it onto the dress. So now all of my trim is gathered down by hand, and I am just going to be pressing it open, opening it up and then pressing it so that it stays open, and it also will kind of like press it in place so it has this really cool textured ripple effect, and I love this. I feel like this trim is so easy yet time consuming, but it just looks so good. And like basically at this point I was kind of already laying these onto my dress, and I was realizing, holy crap, I'm going to be a pumpkin. So I am now tacking down my trim, and I knew from my last video, or my 2 videos ago, from my the skirt, the underskirt, that I wanted to add beads to this, and I refrained from adding them to the sleeves because I didn't think the sleeves needed it, but I think that this little green sparkly bugle bead inside of this looks phenomenal, and I decided I wanted to try to cut down on my time on how long this is going to take me, so I decided to add them when I was tacking down or sewing down my trim versus sewing these down and then tacking this down. And I'm so glad I did that. This was something I mentioned in my last video, which was on a different petticoat that I was making, and I discussed how I wish I would have done this then, but essentially all I'm doing is the bugle beads are probably like between 1/4 of an inch and 1/2 an inch long, and I will basically sew it down, and then I will come back through and go about the length of the bugle bead away from it, and then come back up and sew down another bead, and just kind of rinse and repeat. And I'm really happy I did this because I think it adds a little bit of sparkle and fun. And again, like if you're new here, I don't do things historically accurate 100% of the time. There's a time and a place for historical accuracy, and I'm not really there yet. I am like 50% accurate, maybe less. But anyway, this is the last step. So let's see how this thing turned out. Let's move. I'm a pumpkin now, guys. Let's see how this turned out. Overall, the only disappointment I have with this is the stomacher. It is not the right size at all, and that's something that I should have done last versus second. But aside that, I really love the colors and just how this looks, and it honestly looks like a pumpkin to me. So I don't know. I love it. I'm happy with how it turned out. Would I ever remake it? Probably not. But I'm just glad that I learned some new things. Doing my hair was absolutely miserable, but I will definitely have to take another stab at it. If you guys like this video, please give it a thumbs up, comment below, and if you like sewing, subscribe to my channel, and don't forget that I have a Patreon where you get an exclusive vlog for this video, and there's also lots of cool content and stuff. So yeah, I hope to see you guys over there.